And I'm really excited that you are here to learn more about trauma. It is everywhere. And if you work with people for very long, you definitely encounter a lot of trauma. It's hard sometimes to wrap your brain around it. It's hard sometimes to think about the amount of trauma that our world and our society experiences, but it is a very real thing. And it can be difficult when you learn a lot of skills, when you understand healing, when you're trusting God for what's best for the people that you're working with, and then you encounter a situation where all the normal things just don't seem to work the way they should, and even the way that you've seen them work in the past. Working with trauma, and especially complex trauma, can be stretching, to say the very, very least. Have you ever tried to blow a balloon up, and if it's some of them are just really hard and really tight, and you just got to take them and you got to stretch them a little bit first and then try blowing in them again, and they blow a little easier? Well, I kind of liken that to what we'll be doing in course. Haven't encountered much complex trauma, or if you have and you're like, oh my goodness, I need more skills and more tools. If we can stretch you a little bit in this course, then when you're out there one-on-one with someone who is in a crisis, or it's who just is trying to heal, you'll be pre-stretched and it may go a little bit smoother and a little bit easier for you. Our creator, he is sovereign and he is good, but he is also very complex. And I'm grateful that he gave us a lot of simple tools that can help us when we work with other people. But as far as you and I go, those simple tools can sometimes feel a little complex or feel a little overwhelming. All right, so let's start by talking about why it's important to understand complex trauma versus trauma. There is a difference, and you will find that someone who has had a traumatic experience, or maybe someone who has had a traumatic life or a traumatic past and has already had a lot of healing, they may be able to work through some of the tools that you have for counseling and for prayer quickly, and sometimes even effortlessly. Like, that doesn't happen often. You've usually worked a bit to get to that point, but you know what to do and you feel confident in those situations. When you have someone who is just starting their healing journey, or who just has a lot of trauma in their past, we call that complex trauma. Now, when we talk about the word trauma, that can be a little bit hard to grasp as well. For some of you, you get it. Trauma is, it's hard things, it's bad things, it's feeling a lack, it's feeling no worth, it's being under attack, it's all of those things. But for many people still in society, as well as the Christian world, trauma equates to really bad things happening. And so when we think of someone having a trauma, we think of somebody that's been kidnapped, or somebody that was abused or molested, or somebody that has been in a natural disaster. And we can kind of easily say, oh, that was traumatic, that was really hard, or that was really bad. But the reality is, trauma is simply anything that overwhelms your nervous system that you are unable to regulate through. So if someone experiences something really difficult, which we all do at some point in life, we very easily can become dysregulated. We can flip our lid, our nervous system gets outside of the window of tolerance. And when that happens, we are our brain and our body is trying to figure out, can I get through this? Like, do I know what to do? Do I have the tools? Can I process it? Can I move forward? And often it can take 2 to 4 weeks, depending on what just happened, to process it. And that could include a family member dying unexpectedly, the sudden loss of a job. That happened a lot when we had a lot of job loss around COVID, and even prior to that. When the economy hits and you can't find a home, or you can't sell your home, and you're just kind of in a very, very stressful moment, or receiving really bad news. All of those things have the potential of turning into trauma. What happens is we get dysregulated, and we are processing, and our brain is trying to find a way to grasp and understand, and we're trying to feel all the things that we need to feel. And it can take a little bit. Sometimes we can regulate with, in a few minutes, depending on what happened, sometimes a few hours, sometimes a few days. But the general rule is if you're at 2 to 4 weeks after whatever the incident was, and you're still not back to yourself, you're still pretty dysregulated, or your functioning is much lower than usual, we would classify that as trauma. And it's hard to recover from that if you don't have some help or have some information, some resources. In Carl Leemann's book, Outsmarting Yourself, he talks about this, and he talks about the importance of support and relational connection when we experience suffering, when we experience very difficult things. And he says in most cases, when we experience those difficult things, if we have a good support system, if we have some relational connection and some skills and some resources, it does not turn into trauma. We're able to process our way through it. That may still take a few days. That may take a minute to do it, but we're able to. It's possible. That 2 to 4 week mark is when we're overwhelmed to the point of, I've exhausted everything I have, and I cannot work my way out of this. Maybe you do have a good support system. Maybe you have an amazing support system. And yet you're like, I'm not recovering. Like, I'm not able to let go of this. That is trauma. That is a traumatic experience. Now, Dr. Leeman does specify in his book that when the situation is very, very intense, that the support system and the skills, they can't compensate for the intensity of the trauma. And in those situations, you need some extra help. And so a lot of the people that may come to you are in that boat. They need some extra help. So when we think about those type of things that can be traumatic, we've already listed a few, the really bad things that we talk about. Well, let's start with trauma A. We'll just work our way through the alphabet a little bit. Trauma A is what we refer to as the absence of good things. And that is one of the hardest ones for people to wrap their brain around, because we don't often think of trauma as the lack of something. We tend to think of trauma B, which is bad things happening. That's what we tend to think of when it comes to trauma. But A can be just as overwhelming. One of the examples that we use all the time in mental health would be a child that grew up with a emotionally detached mother, or an alcoholic father that was just always missing and not really very present. Parents are a huge part of God's design for us to grow and to develop. And when we are lacking emotional resilience in our home, when we're lacking a strong father or mother figure, that can equate to trauma. So we think of the intensity of the situation, which often goes with bad things, and how bad something is to determine if it's traumatic. But we also need to look at the frequency of something, because something can kind of seem minor, but if it happens over and over and over, it becomes traumatic. So intensity and frequency are two of the things that we look at when we're determining the significance of a traumatic event. Having a detached mother, or having, maybe, let's go grown up a little bit, a passive aggressive boss that's just always making little digs here or there, or a neighbor that is just rude and in your space and critical, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a friend, somebody that is not very healthy in their relational connections. The frequency of the criticism, the passive aggressiveness, as we've already mentioned, maybe the straight up insults or rudeness, the frequency of that can create a traumatic experience. And that would be the absence of good things. Bad things, which we've mentioned a few of those as well, somebody getting kidnapped, a child being abused, a car accident, loss of a loved one, or loss of a job. That's really can be very significant, especially if you're the primary provider for your family. each of these things would be something bad that has happened that can be overwhelming and that can create trauma very quickly in somebody's heart. One of the ways that we know if we've hit that place of overwhelm, because here's part of the issue is that if we're dysregulated, if we've kind of flipped our lid, our relational circuits are off, we're not processing things in the normal way. We're not able to problem solve and look at a situation like we might normally look at it. And so, how do you know? If you're not seeing clearly, how do you even know if you're in trauma, if you're experiencing that? One of the things that will happen in our brain is because of the overwhelm, we will think a lot, maybe in different words, but the essence of I can't do this. This is too much. I can't. That I can't, those two words are super important for indicators of a traumatic experience. And it does not help for someone to say, oh, yes, you can. I'm sure if you've experienced those moments before where you're overwhelmed and you're like, I just can't do it. And someone's like, oh, yeah, you can. You're good. You're a quality person. Like you've got the skills. And you're like, does that pep talk help you? The majority of the time, no. Sometimes it may, depending on if that person has a lot of credibility in your life. Maybe you kind of toughen up and you're like, okay, I'm going to give it a go one more time. But if you're overwhelmed, that pep talk is not going to be enough to push through. So when you're working with someone, those are phrases to look for, not to fix and to say, oh, they need a pep talk because they don't think they can, but I think they can. No, no, no. You listen to that as a clue of, oh, okay, this person is experiencing trauma. Whether I see it or understand it or not, they're experiencing trauma. So I need to switch into some trauma skills to try to help them cope. So where trauma C comes in would be complex trauma. And with complex trauma, that can be a combination of both A and B. So maybe there was a lot of the absence of good things and bad things happened. Or complex trauma can just be something that is very unusual, uh, things that we don't hear of often. I guess I'll say it that way, can be complex trauma because people just don't know what to do with it. And facilitators, counselors, pastors, people that have been doing prayer ministry for years and years, many people are not trained in helping these complex, less talked about situations. And so it moves it into that complex trauma category. So a lot of where complex trauma develops from is childhood trauma. Childhood trauma is really an interesting thing because we don't often, I don't know, there's different perspectives on this. And one phrase that you hear all the time, and I sort of have mixed feelings about it, is children are resilient. So, wow, they went through such this hard time, and look, they're laughing or they're playing. Children are so resilient. Or, yeah, I had a bad day, but they'll be fine. Kids are resilient, they'll get over it. Whatever it is, that can be really a double-edged sword because children are developing. Children are don't even have their full brain capacity yet. They are learning about the world around them, and their perspective is just naturally very narrow and very simple and very innocent. And that is kind of fragile. And that's why God set up the family. That's why He established that so that there would be a safe place for kids to grow and to learn and to develop all the things that they do. On the other hand, God knew that children would not always grow up in a safe home. And that doesn't mean that there's a whole lot of bad things or abuse, but sometimes that just means the parents maybe had some abuse. The parents aren't developed in the skills that they need to be developed in. And so, because of that, the parents can't parent to the full capacity that God intended. And so the kids may suffer in that regard. And so God did create some resiliency backups in kids to help kids survive really awful things. So as we work with an adult who is having the signs and indications of complex trauma, we need to be aware that there may be something all the way back to their childhood that is contributing to their complex trauma symptoms. One of the mechanisms that God gave each of us to deal with overwhelming traumatic things is called denial. So denial is a challenging word. It's honestly one of the most challenging things to deal with when you're trying to heal or trying to help someone heal. And how that typically looks is, one, we just don't have any memories of the bad things. Or two, we have memories, but we minimize them, or we compare it to other people had it worse, or we don't take them super seriously. All of those are forms of denial. And when we have a lot of trauma and we don't have the skills or the resources to process and to heal from that, that denial kicks in to keep us from staying in that state of overwhelm. So when you think of a child that is not grown developmentally, their brain is not fully developed, their view of the world is very, very narrow, and they have a lot of bad things happen to them, or they don't get a lot of the good things that they need, that denial kicks in so that they don't live in a state of overwhelm and dysfunction, so that they're able to function and to go to school and play with their friends, and maybe not perfectly, but better than if their brains were to still be stuck in that state of overwhelm. The same is true for us as adults. If we experience trauma, we can go into a place of denial. And so maybe you lose your job suddenly and unexpectedly, and you are the primary caregiver for your family. And you're like, I don't even know, I don't know how we're going to pay the rent. I don't know how we're going to eat. I don't know how we're going to move forward. And you can't seem to find a job. And as it escalates more and more, you can't find a job. And you have to push forward and do something. That is overwhelming. That is trauma. But if you live in that state of overwhelm of the situation, you can't move forward. How do you fill out a resume? How do you do applications? How do you go to interviews if you can't even function? And so that denial will kick into your brain that will say, it's fine. I'm fine. Everybody's fine. I just need more coffee, or I just need a day of rest. I just need to take a weekend off and I'll be okay. Maybe. But if you do those things and you're still overwhelmed and not functioning, that's denial. It's not really embracing how deeply pained and grieved you are because of the situation. And we have to work past denial and be able to embrace the gravity of the situation that we're in order to truly improve our functioning. When you are able to do that and help the people that you're working with do that, you will make more progress. But in order to dispel the denial, you must embrace the pain. And that is where working with trauma can really get complicated. And that's where a lot of caregivers, truthfully, a lot of caregivers just fall short in that area because it's hard. That may be some of the hardest work that you ever do, is just allowing someone to be in their pain and being there with them. We're going to learn about how to do that in both a safe way and an effective way as we move through this course. Now, as we grow and as we learn, so moving from childhood to adulthood, we do have more brain development and more skills are available to us to process things. We can learn how to turn on our relational circuits. We can learn about spiritual warfare. We can have maybe a healthier, not healthier, because kids can be healthy in their limited perspective. So we'll say a wider perspective of the world around us, and that can help us. However, if we're missing skills, or if we've had a lot of complex trauma as adults, it can still make it very difficult to access those skills in your brain because they still haven't developed fully. And so we have to keep that in mind. When I teach people about working with trauma, In those situations, what I find is that people have a lot more compassion for the kid that's been through trauma and that's acting out than they do for the adult who has been through trauma and is acting out. And there seems to be this kind of hidden belief that says, oh, but if you're a grown up, if you're past a certain age, then somehow that disqualifies you from being able to struggle. Like somehow you should be able to pull it together quicker. Like I get it if the 4-year-old or the 6-year-old is having difficulty, but you are grown up. That's just not accurate. It's not healthy and it's not helpful. Every once in a while, that may be a helpful perspective, but the majority of the time, we have to let these people have the space to grow and to develop because they don't have the skills that's needed to move forward. It's our job to get them those skills or to provide them the space where they can grow them on their own. Patience is key when you're working with trauma. You need to have a lot of patience and you need to be able to work slow. No one would expect that 4, 5, 6-year-old to suddenly be functioning like an adult after a few counseling sessions. When you're working with an adult who is suffering from complex trauma, symptoms of complex trauma, you need to have that same level of patience and know that it may be a few years. What's interesting is we can do a lot of spiritual warfare and we can take care of a lot of torment and bondage that way. But God created our brain and our body, our nervous system to develop in a certain way. That development is His design. And so it just takes a little bit of time to work through it. Just like our authority in Christ is part of His design, and we can take authority over Satan quickly, our body and our brain is on a whole different pace. It's on a whole different scale, and it's made to develop and grow. And we have to be patient and give the space for that to happen.